Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of the Energy Systems Integration Group. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on ESIG. For those of you not familiar with ESIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information and resources for renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions. We do this through our workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working groups, and technical resource materials. Our most recent activity was our annual Forecasting and Markets Workshop, which was held online during the month of June due to the coronavirus. Our webinar sessions are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the ESIG website. Our workshops deal with a full range of issues associated with integrating wind, solar, and storage into electric, gas, and thermal systems. They also deal with the coupling to energy-consuming infrastructures, especially electric transportation, buildings, and industry. ESIG is a very unique organization, and I don't think you'll find anything quite like it anywhere else in the world. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find us on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For the Q&A, we've been trying something a little different lately. We've moved to the Slido platform, and we are asking attendees to ask their questions through Slido at slido.com. You'll not be able to ask your questions through WebEx. You should go to slido.com on your device and enter today's date, July 1, as the event code to ask your questions. The instructions are also at the bottom of this screen and in the webinar announcement at the bottom of the session information box on the website. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the question to allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize the questions submitted. We plan to wrap it up at the top of the hour, and an email with a link will be provided once the video file has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. Okay, so today our webinar is on the topic of NREL's Electrification Futures Study. Based on registrations, it looks like this is another quite popular topic. The webinar will feature Caitlin Murphy, a researcher with NREL, who is involved with many different aspects of renewable energy analysis. Caitlin is a Senior Energy Analyst with the Economics and Forecasting Group at NREL, where she works with a bright bunch of people focusing on how technology innovation, end-use electrification, and energy policies impact the evolution and operation of the U.S. energy system. I noticed that Caitlin's undergraduate degree is from my alma mater, MIT, where she graduated in 2007, about 37 years after me. Oh well, Caitlin, better late than never. She went on to get her Ph.D. from Caltech in 2012, and her current work deals with understanding the impacts of renewables on the planning and operation of power systems. I feel very fortunate to have Caitlin here with us today. On a personal note, I did take a look on LinkedIn last night, as I usually do, and I found that Caitlin and I already have 8 mutual connections, among whom are some of the usual suspects like True Mai, who works in the group, and Ryan Weiser at LB&L. Caitlin has only been at NREL for 2.5 years, and I wish her a long and productive career in the industry. I greatly value the contributions of Caitlin and NREL to ESIG and the industry, and I look forward to what she has to say. On today's webinar, we will hear about NREL's Electrification Futures Study, which was designed to explore scenarios and impacts of widespread electrification in the U.S. Previously published results explored the transformation that would occur within the transportation, buildings, and industry sectors with mass adoption of end-use electric technologies. The resulting changes in the magnitude, timing, and flexibility of electricity demand provides the focus for the analysis that Caitlin will present in the webinar today. Okay, just a short reminder once again to use Slido at slido.com with the event code of today's date, July 1, to ask your questions. Now, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Caitlin, I'll now turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you to ESIG more generally for this opportunity to present some of our recent work on electrification. I'll begin by just acknowledging that this work was sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Strategic Programs. And as Charlie mentioned, the presentation will be based on NREL's Electrification Futures Study, which is a multi-year research effort with multiple phases focusing on different aspects of electrification. This presentation will walk through the full narrative since it's necessary to understand all of the previously published work and how it feeds into the focus of today's webinar, which is on end-use electrification as a source of power system flexibility. And this is the phase of work for the EFS that I led up along with a variety of colleagues at NREL and other institutions. So I wanted to begin the presentation just with some scopes and definitions for the Electrification Futures Study and this presentation more broadly. For this series of analysis efforts, we've defined electrification as the shift from any non-electric source of energy to electricity at the point of final consumption. So this doesn't necessarily consider the full universe of potential new electric loads in the future, since we aren't considering indirect pathways such as electrolysis, producing hydrogen that's then used to power fuel cell electric vehicles, for example, nor are we considering potential new sources of electricity demand like indoor agriculture or power to gas. So this isn't the full range of possibilities, but it does represent a very large opportunity for new electricity demand or load growth in the future, as indicated by the figure on the right. So all of the subsectors that lie above the solid black line where the arrows are pointing, those represent the end-use subsectors whose power or energy is currently sourced primarily from direct fuel use. And if the box itself represents 74% of primary energy consumption in the United States in 2015. So not only is there a large share of energy demand that is currently provided by direct fuel use, but this is also a large share of our total energy demand across the economy. So the scope of our work is really this chart on the right, with the exception of a few end-use sectors that we feel are maybe not as amenable to electrification, including things like air transport, petroleum refining and mining, combined heat and power applications, and outdoor cooking, some of which might not be amenable to electrification, and others just introduce some complexities that weren't included in the scope of our study. So this is the scope and definition that we've adopted for the Electrification Futures Study, which I mentioned is a multi-year study led by NREL, but with a variety of research partners across the National Lab Complex and also with external organizations. The outline on the right shows the series of products and publications that have come out of the Electrification Futures Study, which take the form of reports, data sets, and also models and tools that can be downloaded and used by research colleagues and by the participants in the webinar today. These are color-coded based on the status of the products. So the blue products are all fully published and available online on our website. The green products are under review for publication, and the yellow product at the bottom, or the orange, is analysis that we are wrapping up now and will be published in the future. The check marks here indicate what I will walk through today, which is sort of the complete narrative of how we've approached this question of electrification by trying to tie together capabilities across the different parts of NREL. So those of us who focus on demand-side adoption helped inform some of our demand-side adoption scenarios, which are then feeding into our supply-side scenarios, which are primarily the focus of my presentation and my part of this project. So this slide presents an overview of our approach and the analysis workflow within the EFS. So the entire effort is rooted in a variety of well-established data sets and data sources, which primarily are provided by NREL or the Energy Information Administration. These data sources are then fed into a variety of models that are run by NREL or some of our research partners to develop a series of scenarios that help inform this question of electrification and what it could mean for the power sector and broader implications for society. So the bottom of the chart here shows the workflow of scenarios that I'll walk through in this presentation, beginning with the demand side scenarios. So these are the scenarios in the Electrification Futures Study that look at how customer adoption of end-use electric technologies could evolve over time under a range of different assumptions, and what this would mean for both hourly and annual electricity demand, which would ultimately be what drives changes in the power sector in response to changes in end-use electric technology adoption. So to give you a flavor of our demand-side adoption scenario, which is published and available on our website, what we did was approached end-use customer adoption of key electro technologies based on previous cost and performance assumptions, adoption modeling, as well as expert judgment. So this is one snapshot just for the transportation sector, where the chart on the right shows a good comprehensive summary of the result of our demand-side scenarios. So the different columns here represent different levels of electrification. The first column is our reference scenario, which is akin to an annual energy outlook or a business as usual type trajectory, looking at different technology adoption over time, where the warm shades represent electric technologies and the cooler shades represent your incumbent technologies or your conventional direct fuel use technologies. And then each row represents different subsectors within the transportation sector. So the top shows our light duty fleet, working down towards medium, heavy duty vehicles, and finally transit buses. So as you move across the columns, the middle column represents our medium electrification scenario. You could think of this as a scenario that's trying to represent capturing the low-hanging fruit opportunities when it comes to electrification. So you see that the warm shades are primarily popping up in the light-duty vehicle fleet, which might be more amenable to electrification based on the service demand and the state of plug-in electric vehicles, for example. There are also significant opportunities within this scenario for transit bus electrification, which I think reflects what we're seeing in the marketplace today in the United States and in other countries as well. Moving over to the far right column is our high electrification scenario. This is what we would refer to as more of a transformational scenario. So this scenario assumes that there have been breakthroughs in various barriers to electrification, either through policy drivers or through research and development activities that lead to more rapid cost reductions in these technologies. Any regulatory barriers to electrification might be overcome. So this is a truly transformational scenario that looks at widespread electrification across all end-use sectors. And in this case, where you see the warmer shades popping up in more and more of the rows on the right-hand side. So to summarize the results from these figures, focusing on the high electrification scenario, since that's the one that would have the largest impact on our power system response, for example, what we see in these different panels is that light-duty plug-in electric cars and trucks drive the greatest overall electrification impact in all scenarios, and especially in the high electrification scenario. So the results on the right-hand side represent approximately 240 million light-duty plug-in EVs in 2050 under the high electrification scenario, including both battery electric vehicles in the red shade as well as plug-in hybrid electric vehicles in the orange shade right above it. That being said, electric freight trucks also play a major role, particularly for short-haul applications and in the more transformational scenarios. Here, what we find is about 7 million medium and heavy-duty plug-in electric trucks by 2050 under our high electrification scenario. And finally, in the bottom part of the chart, we see not only this significant increase under the medium electrification scenario, but a near complete transformation of the transit bus fleet from conventional technologies to electric technologies by 2050, based on the assumptions of this scenario. So this is the snapshot for the transportation sector, but similar analysis was performed as well for the building sector and also the industrial sector. We do have similar charts for each of these sectors with fidelity for different subsectors and services within them. But the one thing to point out, I would say, is that beyond the transportation results shown here, the next most impactful technology is the air source heat pump, which we analyze for both space heating and cooling applications, as well as water heating applications in both the residential and commercial building sectors. So looking at these results, this tells us a lot about how the end-use equipment stock transforms over time. But if we want to understand what this means for the power sector, the next necessary step is to translate these changes in the equipment stock to differences in electricity demand at both an hourly and annual level. So taking the results from all the different sectors and putting them together, what we come up with are changes in both annual and hourly electricity demand over time, broken down by sector, and also in this chart compared to historical growth rates. So this shows annual electricity demand. On the left-hand side is our historical information, divided over into the modeled results by the solid black line. And what you see under our reference case scenario is a steady increase in electricity demand over time, again, akin to sort of an annual energy outlook with relatively modest growth rates, primarily just due to incremental growth in all sectors due to economic growth and population growth as well. As you move higher and higher into the stacked area chart, you start to see larger blue wedges emerge. This represents the impact of that transportation electrification that I showed on the previous slide on an annual basis, which you see contributes the majority of the new annual electricity demand under our increasing electrification levels. So under that medium electrification scenario, which represents capturing some of that low-hanging fruit opportunity, we see a doubling in the compound annual growth rate of electricity demand over time. Also a significant growth relative to historical growth rates, although not beyond what we've seen in the past. We do see, however, that this growth doesn't occur in the near term. It takes a few years for this evolution to begin, and that primarily is due to stock turnover times that are included in our assumptions. So we're not looking at scenarios where everyone sells their vehicle today and changes to an electric vehicle, for example. We're waiting until this equipment meets the end of its assumed lifetime, and then we apply different purchasing behavior assumptions to look at how the stock would evolve and then therefore how the electricity demand would change as well. So below that medium electrification line there, you see that the majority of the growth does take the form of that blue wedge, which is the transportation electricity demand. This does represent the significant opportunity that exists within the transportation sector, which is primarily sourced with petroleum fuels in today's snapshot. But this also represents the fact that building electric technologies are highly efficient technologies, and in some cases, in our scenarios, they actually displace other less efficient electric technologies, such as baseboard heaters and things like that would be less efficient than their air source heat pump counterparts. So this growth in the transportation sector, I think, is a major result, but to some extent, the building electrification results are muted by just the nature of that sector and the fact that it's already heavily electrified today. So finally, moving up into the high electrification wedge, again, you see a dramatic growth in the blue wedge, which is now primarily due to not only more light-duty vehicle adoption, but also more electrification in the medium and heavy-duty sectors, as well as the transit buses. You also start to see a little bit more visible growth in the buildings and industrial sectors, which represents our more aggressive assumptions under the high electrification scenario, which is quite transformational. So again, the growth rates that we're seeing under the high electrification scenario are quite rapid. They are consistent with some of the most rapid periods of electricity demand growth in our history, but clearly a very stark contrast to what we've seen in recent decades. So this really does represent a dramatic impact to the power sector, which would need to respond to these changes in annual electricity demand. But another important factor is also looking at how the load shape would change under these different levels of electrification, and especially what that would mean for peak demand that the power system would be planning for. So this chart is meant to show sort of the changes in peak demand over time, as well as under increasing levels of electrification. So the map on the left-hand side shows a snapshot from 2015, where the size of the pie charts represent the top hour of electricity demand, and the wedges within the chart represent the distribution of the top 100 hours of electricity demand over the course of the year. So warm shades here represent summer and fall peaking regions, whereas the blue shades and light green would show when a region might have peak demand occurring within the winter months instead. In 2015, we see that the majority of the country is summer peaking, and the size of the peak demand depends strongly on which state you're in, largely due to sort of your typical factors of population and also the climate that's invoking air conditioning and heating demands, for example. By 2050, though, under our high electrification scenario, the picture looks quite different. In all states, the size of the circle has grown, indicating an increase in peak demand. But what you also start to see is a change in the shading of those pie charts, indicating that in some regions, we're starting to shift into winter peaking periods, especially in the Northeast, for example, which is driven primarily by the adoption of electric technologies for space heating demands in those regions, due to our assumptions about cold climate heat pumps in particular. The effects of transportation electrification here are more muted due to the fact that those demands occur throughout the year, whereas your space heating demands would really only show up in the winter months, showing this transition in certain regions where heating demands might be a little bit higher. So all of this served as the foundation for our power system modeling of the impacts of electrification, which is the phase of the study that I led and the focus of today's presentation. Basically, what we did was take all the information about hourly electricity demand profiles from the previous phase of the study and fed those into our capacity expansion model, which is the Regional Energy Deployment System model developed and run by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So this work was based on the 2018 version of the REEDS model, but in order to capture the unique aspects of electrification, we actually modified that model to represent some features that you might expect under dramatic shifts in energy consumption across our economy. So those model improvements are listed in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. The one I want to focus on today is our demand-side flexibility changes, since that's the focus of the presentation. Basically, what we did was modify the model to be able to represent load shifting with a relatively high level of fidelity within the structure of the REEDS model. So what we wanted to be able to do is represent the different amounts of flexibility that you would expect from different end-use services and their demands. So for example, one can imagine that electric vehicle charging might be more flexible because we don't spend the whole day driving, and we might be able to shift our charging by a few hours depending on what our service demands are and where we are charging in particular. On the other hand, you might expect more limited flexibility in something like air conditioning or heating, where the comfort of your home really drives how long you're willing to let the utility shift some of your demand, probably over a much shorter period of time to maintain the comfort of your home or your commercial building, for example. So we wanted to capture all of that nuance within the REEDS model and its architecture to really try to understand what role flexibility could play in the evolution of the power system in response to electrification, which, as one might expect, would inherently increase the interconnectedness of the demand sectors and the power sector as more and more of our services are met by electricity under our electrification scenarios. So just a quick slide of transition here to mention that the material that I'll be presenting for the remainder of the webinar is based on unpublished work. This is the part of the presentation where we'd certainly welcome your technical review of the analysis that was recently completed or is currently in progress. Also, please do not distribute, cite, or quote any of the slides from here on out. These are really for discussion purposes, and all the results are subject to change based on the ongoing or forthcoming review of our analysis. So really what we set out to do in my phase of the analysis is try to understand that if widespread electrification does occur, how would the U.S. power system need to evolve in terms of the mix, magnitude, and location of new bulk power system infrastructure development, as well as impacts on the generation mix and utilization of different classes of generation and transmission assets. So to try to address these questions, we adopted a scenario analysis approach, which is really designed to isolate the impacts of electrification across a wide range of what we refer to as supply-side assumptions. So in all cases, what we want to understand are the themes that emerge in terms of the impact that electrification has on power system evolution, regardless of our assumptions about natural gas prices, renewable energy costs, and system constraints. So in all cases, what we're looking for is how the results of a given scenario based on a set of supply-side assumptions differ when we evolve the end-use electricity demand and the load profiles associated with them. So what we're looking for is that delta between a reference electrification version of a given scenario and a high electrification version with the same assumptions about gas prices, renewable costs, and system constraints. In addition to our supply-side variation that I just described, we also explored a variety of demand-side sensitivities. The most important for today's webinar being the demand-side flexibility assumptions that I'll describe in more detail in a couple of slides. So for the next few slides, I just want to walk through a couple of the main findings from our analysis. Again, these are all focused on differences between reference and high electrification versions of the same scenario, so trying to isolate that impact of electrification within the REEDS or capacity expansion model results. So the first finding here is written as electrification drives the sustained deployment of natural gas and renewable energy generators in all regions and in turn increases generation from these sources. So this map here shows the capacity mix and how it changes over time in various regions across the continental United States. The left-hand bar in each panel refers to the 2018 electricity generation mix based on the annual energy outlooks, for example, and data provided by EIA, whereas the 2050 stacked bar shows how the capacity mix has changed over time as well as under increasing levels of electrification. So this result represents our high electrification assumptions. So in all panels across the map, what we see is that the total installed capacity increases dramatically by 2050. In all regions, it's an approximate doubling of total installed capacity. We also see that the striping in these stacked bar charts change over time, with the majority of new capacity taking the form of solar, wind, and natural gas technologies. This represents a combination of changes in the annual and peak demand due to our electrification assumptions, as well as retirements over time and changes in the capacity factor of the dominant technologies in our capacity mix. So all of that is contributing to the approximate doubling in installed capacity in all regions across the continental United States by 2050. So the stacked bar charts are specific to our capacity mix changes over time, but another result that's shown on this map is how the transmission infrastructure would need to evolve to accommodate the changing loads associated with increasing electrification. So in all cases, the yellow lines represent the current installed transmission capacity across the United States, specific to long distance transmission, so the transmission that's connecting the different regions within the REEDS model. Whereas the red lines, which you see in certain regions of the country, represent the new installed transmission capacity as a result of electrification and other demand growth over time by 2050. So the dominance of the yellow lines here show us that we're mostly relying on and increasing the utilization of our existing transmission network, and the incremental needs under high electrification might be more modest than one would expect. So we do see new transmission capacity, of course, to accommodate all of this new transmission or all of the new generation capacity shown in the stacked bar charts. But actually the amount of new transmission capacity is relatively similar between our reference and high electrification scenarios. So the incremental change that's driven by electrification itself is relatively modest, both compared to our current installed capacity as well as to the amount of capacity increase over time. This is partially due to the fact, though, that some of the increase in transmission capacity takes the form of local transmission or spur line transmission capacity. That's what's shown by the shading within the balancing areas on this map, where you see that in certain regions, especially regions where there is strong growth in variable renewable energy generation, there is significant growth as well in spur line transmission capacity. So in many cases, this does scale more directly with electrification due to the increasing generation assets associated with our high electrification scenarios. So if we take all of this regional detail and condense it down into the national results, what we see here is the annual capacity additions under the same scenario with high electrification put into the context of historical capacity additions on the bulk power system. So the panel on the left shows growth over time of various technologies and how we've transitioned through different generation technologies as they become cost competitive. It also shows recent transitions into natural gas and variable renewable generation in the early 2000s and into the recent decade. And this transitions into the panel on the right-hand side, which shows our model results under our high electrification scenario, again with annual capacity additions across the entire country. So what we see here is that by 2030, our model results are showing between 60 and 90 gigawatts of new generation capacity on the bulk power system every year. Again, these primarily take the form of solar in yellow, wind in blue, and natural gas-fired generation in the brown shades here. We do see that this is significantly higher on a capacity basis than recent additions or than any period of time in additions on the bulk power system. But if we look instead at the compound annual growth rate of capacity additions, this is more in line with historical rates. And this reflects the fact that our power system has already grown to be quite large. And so the addition of 30 gigawatts today is very different than the addition of 30 gigawatts in the 1990s, for example. But it also represents the fact that we're growing it more and more every year. So the growth rate ends up being approximately consistent with historical growth rates or below some of our most rapid periods of growth on the power system. So all of the results I've shown so far are based on our default assumptions for the supply side. So this is sort of your annual energy outlook reference case type assumptions for gas prices and renewable costs. I mentioned before we took a scenario analysis approach to this study, trying to look at a range of supply side and demand side assumptions. And this chart here is meant to summarize the results across all of those scenarios. So each bar represents the result that I just showed. So it's the average annual capacity addition in a given decade for a variety of technologies for electricity generation on the bulk power system. And then what looks to be here like error bars show the range in deployment rates associated with the full suite of scenarios that we explored. So for all technologies, there's really a very large range in their annual capacity additions, depending on what our assumptions are, usually about that technology itself. So low gas prices would result in more annual capacity additions for our gas-fired technologies and corresponding decreases on the renewable energy side of things, for example. And the inverse would be true if we were to adopt low renewable energy cost assumptions. That would result in higher deployment rates for solar, wind, and other renewable technologies, as well as for storage technologies, and corresponding reductions in our gas-fired deployment rates. So the summary here is really that the absolute generation mix in the future depends on a number of very uncertain assumptions, but ultimately all of these results involve similar total capacity increases, which are on the order of an approximate doubling of total installed capacity relative to what we have on the system today, sometimes upwards of nearly a tripling. So moving on from our capacity expansion and generation results, we can start to look at the impacts of demand-side flexibility, which is the focus of this presentation. So our finding related to demand-side flexibility reads that electrification inherently increases the reliance of demand sectors on electricity and could offer enhanced opportunities for more active participation from flexible loads in planning and operations of the bulk power system. So to evaluate this within the capacity expansion modeling framework, as I mentioned, we did some work on our demand-side flexibility representation. Within the READS model, we modeled demand-side flexibility as shiftable load, and this load was parameterized based on the timing, duration, direction, and participation of the various subsectors within buildings, transportation, and industry. So the details are shown on the right-hand side, but ultimately what we've done is parameterized each type of flexibility based on how likely a consumer is willing to be flexible in terms of how long they will allow for the shifting of their electricity demand and how much of their demand they would be willing to be flexible. What we see is that this varies not only across the sectors, but also based on our electrification levels. So under reference electrification in the bottom middle of the chart, it's apparent that the largest source of flexibility in terms of terawatt hours takes the form of residential flexibility. So this is your air conditioning and your heating loads, for example, primarily due to different availabilities and willingness of customers to participate in programs over time. But the opportunities in the transportation sector, for example, are much more limited due to the fact that under our reference assumptions, there's very little electric vehicle technology adoption by 2050. If we move over instead into the high electrification scenario, now we see that transportation is by far the dominant source of flexibility due to both the fact that the large growth in transportation electricity demand under this scenario, but also the fact that we assume that transportation electricity demand is more flexible than other loads due to the fact that you probably don't care if your charging happens at 10 p.m. or at 2 a.m. or at 5 a.m. as long as you're getting your service met before you need your car the next day, for example. So here we see that the amount of flexibility varies not only by sector, but also based on our electrification assumptions. So optimized EV charging makes up the majority of our flexibility, but managed building loads and industrial loads are also represented in our REEDS model and available for load shifting across the time slices within the model structure. And really the goal of this within the model structure, which is to minimize, or it's a least cost optimization of power system costs. What these resources offer to the power system is a reduction in peak load and increasing utilization of assets that might be able to be used more efficiently across the power system if the load can be moved into a different time of day, for example. So the net result of these different assumptions about flexibility, sorry, let me go back for just a second. I forgot to mention that in our scenario analysis, we explored 3 different levels of demand-side flexibility. Our current scenario is based on an extrapolation of existing demand-side flexibility programs or load shifting programs. Our base flexibility assumes that we achieve similar levels of participation across different sectors of the economy. So not only looking at residential programs, for example, but translating some of those into additional flexibility in other sectors. And our enhanced flexibility scenario is really, again, more of a transformational scenario where we're looking at more customer willingness to participate in flexibility, as well as increasing amounts of flexibility within a given subsector. So when we look at how those different levels of the different levels of demand-side flexibility impact the power system investment and operational needs, what we see is that the main effects of this demand-side flexibility is that they can mitigate some of the power sector infrastructure needs and the associated costs from electrification, and they can also increase the efficiency with which the power system is operated. So all of these results show changes in installed capacity and changes in power system costs relative to the results that I've shown already for sort of our default assumptions in all cases. So what we see under different levels of electrification is that our increasing amounts of flexibility would result in reduced installed capacity on the power system under base assumptions as well as under enhanced assumptions, and that along with having to build less capacity on the power system, we also have lower power system costs. And these equate to approximately $16 to $19 per megawatt hour in terms of the value that flexible loads provide to the power system. I should note that these are not meant to be bounding scenarios by any means. We haven't explored scenarios with no flexibility, for example, and we also would not refer to our enhanced demand-side flexibility scenarios as the upper bound of what's possible in terms of demand-side flexibility. What we really wanted to do here is explore a range of assumptions and try to understand what the value of demand-side flexibility could be for the power system in terms of avoiding investments that might be needed and increasing the efficiency with which the power system is operated. One example of which would be reducing curtailments, reducing ramp rates, for example, and increasing the capacity factor of assets that remain on the system. So tying all of this work together and introducing the phase of analysis that we're in the process of right now, this is again sort of a workflow across the electrification futures study. So we began with our end-use technology adoption or demand-side scenarios, which helped us define future trajectories for annual and hourly electricity demand. This was based on modeling in the energy pathways and adopt models, but ultimately what came out of both of these efforts is electricity demand profiles that could be fed into our capacity expansion model to look at how the bulk power system would need to evolve in terms of the generation, transmission, and storage assets on the system, as well as how the power system is operated within the time slice structure of the REEDS model, accounting for some of the model development changes that were needed to be able to represent the impacts of electrification on the power system. So with the results that I just showed, the next stage of the analysis is to take our capacity expansion results and try to validate some of our findings using more detailed operational models of the power system. So the phase of analysis that we're in now is using the PLEXOS model to try to look at hourly power system operations under our high electrification assumptions in 2050. So the specific scenario dimensions are listed on the right-hand side. We are using the hourly and zonal formulation of PLEXOS, including unit commitment and dispatch. The year of analysis is 2050, and the range of VRE penetration levels on an annual basis spans the 40% to 66% range. We looked again at scenarios with reference and high electrification so that we could isolate the impacts of electrification on the operational results for PLEXOS. And we also looked at a range of flexibility assumptions. So similar to the parameterization that I showed for reads, we look at 3 different levels of flexibility in PLEXOS. In this case, we do look at a no flexibility scenario to try to have a baseline that looks at no flexibility from demand sectors and what that would mean for the operation of the power system. The moderate scenario assumptions are similar to what we have for our base scenario in reads. And our high flexibility scenario, again, looks at sort of that transformational scenario where customers are very willing to let the power system move loads around in a way that minimizes system costs. A couple of other important things to mention about the PLEXOS analysis. We did represent units individually for thermal generators. This helps us look at things like ramp rates and utilization impacts on those generators under increasing levels of electrification and VRE penetration. Again, looking at the impacts of demand side flexibility. We also represented operating reserves so that we could look at whether the system could be could be operated in a resource adequate way under high levels of electrification, VRE penetration, and flexibility. And to parameterize the demand side flexibility within PLEXOS, we did develop 14 different objects per BA to represent the different types of flexibility and magnitudes of flexibility that would be associated with each of the different demand subsectors. So similar to the reads results again, but now with much higher fidelity since we're looking at hourly operations and we're not constrained by the time slice structure of the reads model, for example. So this analysis is still ongoing, and I don't want to present too many results, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the topics that will be covered in this study listed on the left-hand side. So first, I think one of the purposes of this PLEXOS analysis is really to validate the results and to determine whether power system operations under high electrification and high VRE penetration scenarios are feasible, considering resource adequacy and economics as our primary metrics. So if we take our reads results and feed it into the PLEXOS model, looking at metrics like unserved load, unserved operating load, for example, unserved operating reserves, can give us a sense of whether our reads results are giving us reliable solutions in terms of what the power system could do to evolve to meet changing electricity demand under increasing electrification. Another major focus of our PLEXOS analysis will be trying to look at the role that demand-side flexibility could play to support adequate operations of the bulk power system, again, considering a wide range of VRE penetration and flexibility assumptions. One result for this is shown on the right-hand side, the top panel being an hourly dispatch chart for our high VRE scenario for a spring day, for example, where VRE resources provide up to 89% of electricity demand on an hourly basis. So this chart has a similar color code as before. You're seeing dispatch or generation from wind and solar. The dashed line here represents our default load profile. So this would be our default native assumptions for hourly electricity demand under our high electrification scenario. And then the top of the stacked area chart is what shows you how the power system actually operates based on dispatching our flexible load. So what we're seeing in this case on a national basis is the shifting of load away from this previous peak, moving that load into the daytime hours instead so that we can absorb some of that solar generation that would otherwise need to be curtailed. This is a national average result, so the result does differ by region depending on what the generation mix is and the alignment of load with the VRE resources that would be available in that region. But in general, what we are seeing is that the power system does see a significant value in having access to these flexible loads and being able to shift them into times when low marginal cost generators are available to provide electricity. Either in the middle of the day in the case of solar or sometimes in the middle of the night for wind resources. So finally, another topic to be covered in our PLEXOS analysis will be looking at utilization trends for different generator types. So I just mentioned how our VRE sources can be used in different ways depending on the level of flexibility that is assumed. Another result that we do explore in the study is the ramp rates and dispatch of fuel-based generation. So you can see discrete ramps on our gas-fired generators here at the bottom of the chart on the top. Again, this is just for one day, but it does allow us to look at individual commitment and dispatch of units and trying to understand how electrification, VRE penetration, and flexibility impact the utilization of our dispatchable generators on the system. So I'll conclude by just summarizing the EFS approach more generally. I didn't mention, but the whole study began with our trajectories for cost and performance of key electro technologies through 2050. This really served as the foundation for our demand side scenarios that I did present results for today. So trying to understand which technologies could be cost effective in the future and where we might see the greatest potential for electrification across different subsectors and across the country. These demand scenarios really explored sort of what if in terms of technology adoption and electricity demand and resulted in hourly, state, and subsector profiles for electricity demand to feed into our power system analysis. So the results today were primarily based on our capacity expansion modeling, which were used to generate scenarios of power sector evolution over time, as well as across different scenarios for both supply side assumptions and demand side assumptions. And finally, the results of our capacity expansion modeling are being validated through higher resolution modeling of power system operations in 2050 under some of the most transformational scenarios. In terms of next steps, I think there are a variety of open questions that deserve attention following this analysis and also building off some of the research in other parts of the community. A few of them are listed here. I would just note that one of the most important things is that there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from our results in terms of broader societal impacts that won't be looked at in a lot of detail in our studies. So for example, looking at some of the health and environmental changes that might be associated with electrification, that would require very high resolution modeling of pollutants and understanding what that means for the local community. That was all beyond the scope of our electrification future study, but I think a natural next step to go to try to understand any potential health benefits associated with electrification, at least in certain regions of the country, for example. I think there's also a lot of really important research to be done in terms of the behavioral and technical constraints on flexibility. So we took an approach of looking at different levels and different assumptions to try to understand whether there are sort of declining returns on investment as you get higher and higher in your amount of flexibility. But ultimately, I think our understanding more broadly about how flexible people are willing to be and what drives their willingness to be flexible, I think that's another really important area of research to try to understand how the utilization of that flexibility might change with increasing levels of electrification and whether there are barriers that would need to be addressed in that space. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, Caitlin, thank you for that interesting tour through the world of flexibility. There's one question here that's really risen to the top among all the questions, and let me expand on it a little bit to incorporate some of the other questions down below that haven't quite risen up so high yet. And I think starting with a little bit of a context-setting question of where does the annual penetrations fall? Where does the annual penetration of renewable energy fall? Just to kind of frame the results for the 2050. Are you looking at 50%, 80% annual energy from wind and solar? What kind of ballpark are you in?
Yeah, so it varies strongly across our scenarios, but in general, so I think the PLEXOS slide showed sort of a typical result for us, which would be, sorry, not a typical result, but on the order of 66% VRE penetration in 2050. That's not our most aggressive result, but I think that's a pretty good ballpark.
Okay, so then moving specifically to the first question there, surprising that the natural gas generation increases so strongly by 2050, and how to reconcile that with the recent UC Berkeley study findings. That was the 90% clean energy by 2030 at lower cost than business as usual, and kind of consistent with the news that we're hearing about the accelerated retirement of coal units with the replacement by wind, solar, and storage because they're cheaper than continuing to operate the coal. So, and I think some of that has to do with the cost assumptions that were used for the wind and solar. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I'm not sure how much of a role the cost assumptions for wind and solar play here. The growth in natural gas assets and generation in our scenarios primarily represents the fact that as you use less and less gas on the demand sector, within the demand sector, that will drive down the cost of natural gas and therefore make it more competitive as a bulk power system asset. So our model is seeing here that less consumption in the end use sectors will make gas more competitive and cost competitive within the power system as a generation asset. I think the difference with the Berkeley study here would primarily be that our scenarios do not all consider policy constraints on the power system evolution. We do have one system constraint scenario looking at emission caps over time, and that one certainly would, I think, look more like the Berkeley scenario, although not the same, because our caps wouldn't be aligned with what the Berkeley group has assumed in their study.
But you did use the Reed's model to do generation expansion out to 2050, right?
Yes.
And do you have any idea what the wind and solar cost estimates were into that model?
The wind and solar cost estimates are based on the annual technology baseline. We do look at a range of different costs. So our default assumption would be the annual technology baseline default costs. But we do look at our low and high cost trajectories. The low cost trajectories are consistent with some of the program goals that DOE has established. The high cost trajectories assume no cost reductions from today, which is clearly an upper bound on sort of what the assumptions would be there. But with our low cost assumptions, what we do find is that the capacity mix by 2050 is quite similar to a policy scenario that would place emission constraints on your capacity mix, or sorry, on your generation mix more specifically. So the costs do make a significant impact, and by themselves can get to similar levels of penetration as what you might expect under a more policy-driven scenario.
Mm-hmm. And how about storage? Personally, I was a little surprised not to see more storage out in the 2050 time period. Did that have something to do with all the storage and transportation, or something else?
I think that's more of a bias just from the specific scenario that showed that one snapshot result. Depending on our cost assumptions for storage, we do get upwards of 20 gigawatts per year in the 2030s and 2040s. So leading up to 2050, we would have hundreds of gigawatts of storage on the system. So it really depends on the scenario itself. I would say because this modeling was performed a couple of years ago now, or based on assumptions from a couple of years ago, our storage assumptions, I think, were pretty outdated in this study. If we were to take more current assumptions about the cost trajectory for storage, I think even our default assumptions for high electrification would have a larger deployment of storage technologies. The other thing I'll note is our storage does include a variety of technologies. So some of that is lithium-ion batteries, but some of it is pumped storage in our case as well as compressed air energy storage. All of those technologies are available in Reed's and selected under our high electrification scenarios. Okay,
I think that helps explain a lot, Caitlin. Let's move on to the next question there. Why does residential flexible load not increase substantially despite substantial increase in residential flexible load not increase despite substantial increase in residential loads for water heating and space heating?
Yeah, so first I'll say we don't see substantial increases in residential load for space and water heating, again, due to the fact that the technologies that we are deploying in these scenarios are very efficient. So even though the services are increasing over time due to economic and population growth, the technologies that are providing those services are so efficient that the annual demand associated with them is actually fairly equivalent across all of our scenarios. The reason that the transformation flexibility is so much larger in magnitude is because of our assumptions that EV charging can be shifted more throughout the day compared to something like space heating, where a customer probably only has willingness to let you shift their load by an hour before the indoor temperature becomes too uncomfortable and they would want to put their load back on the system again. So the amount of flexibility depends not only on the amount of load, but also on our flexibility parameterization, which is more generous, if you will, in the transportation sector relative to the building loads.
Okay. Let me ask a related question, which didn't quite make it up to the top yet, but that's for industrial loads. Did you see, or I guess, what's your view on the opportunity for flexibility from industrial loads? It didn't look like there was a lot of electrification of the industrial load that made its way into the results.
Yeah, throughout the electrification futures study, I would say the treatment of industrial loads was always more limited due to just inherent challenges with working with that sector. We did try to limit our electrification analysis for industrial loads to those that would have co-benefits, so increase your productivity, for example, whereas you can imagine some residential or sort of civilian loads having more, being driven by more than one goal. Industrial loads really do, they have a bottom line that they have to meet, and so we didn't want to explore electrification options that would really impact their profitability and therefore impact the competitiveness of the industrial company, for example. So the treatment of industrial electrification was more limited throughout the study. I would say that our flexibility assumptions were also somewhat conservative because we didn't want to overestimate the amount of flexibility from those sources. So I would say that that's another area of very important future research, is really understanding not only the amount of flexibility, but also the potential for electrification within that sector, and specifically within different subsectors of industry, since you can't treat the whole thing the same. Different parts of our industrial sector have very different needs and flexibilities, for example.
And similarly, how about the opportunity for hydrogen in the industrial sector? I know that wasn't within the scope, but do you see that being added to a future phase or see it making much of an impact?
So there are other studies across NREL that are more focused on sort of the hydrogen pathway, I would say. Certainly, I think there's opportunities there, and also opportunities within the power sector as well to look at electrolysis as a way to soak up some of those curtailments that I showed, for example, from the PLEXOS results. So definitely opportunities. This is the end of the electrification futures study. We are wrapping up a multi-year study now, so I don't see us studying anything under this study in the future, but I certainly think there are research activities across NREL that would be looking at that question, both for the industrial sector and for other parts of the economy as well.
Okay, so stay tuned for that one from other sources at NREL.
Yep.
Question on the slides. A link will be sent out after the video is posted, so you'll have access to the video of the webinar within a couple days. Next question on greenhouse gas emissions. Caitlin, what's the carbon story?
Yeah, so for all of our scenarios, what we find is that if we compare our high electrification to reference electrification results, CO2 emissions are always lower under high electrification than they are under reference electrification. And that really reflects all of the displaced emissions within the demand sectors themselves. But an interesting result, I think, from our analysis of the power system evolution, for example, is that regardless of what we assume, and I think our assumptions do span a very wide range of futures for the power sector generation mix in 2050, regardless of what our supply side assumptions are, we always see a total decrease in CO2 emissions under high electrification. So even under those scenarios with a lot of natural gas-fired generation, for example, economy or energy sector-wide CO2 emissions are always lower under high electrification. And that's because of not only the evolving generation mix over time and the replacement of coal-fired generation with gas-fired generation in that case, for example, but also the higher efficiencies associated with producing that electricity and providing those end-use services that are also provided by very high efficiency end-use equipment. So the emission story is always an improvement under high electrification relative to reference electrification, and in some cases approaching that 80% reduction level, for example.
Yeah, I remember some, I guess, rule of thumb numbers from some of the earlier wind and solar integration studies where it was roughly a 1% reduction in carbon emissions for every percentage increase in annual wind or solar penetration. Are there any such similar rules of thumb that you've noticed for the carbon reductions with increased electrification?
I don't have something like that for our study. I think the one result that was, I don't know, surprising is not the right word, but interesting to me is that I think I mentioned before our VRE penetration levels were quite similar under our low RE cost assumptions as well as under our policy or emissions cap consumptions or assumptions. And I thought that was an interesting result to see that the R&D pathway has similar emissions reduction impacts relative to this policy driver, for example.
Okay. I think we'll take one more question and then we'll have to wrap it up. So For all the modelers out there, somebody's having a hard time finding data to model the residential loads, for instance. Could you elaborate on the data used in your models? Where'd you get it from? How hard was it to find? How available is it?
So our residential, well, all of our load data was produced with our energy pathways modeling in terms of the future years, for example. We have posted all of that load data to our analysis webpage, so you can download all of our scenario hourly load profiles at a state level for our different electrification scenarios from the EFS website. We also have our assumptions posted there for what our flexible load looks like. So essentially what we've done is disaggregated total load into our flexible load and our unflexible load, or our static load is sort of how we put it into our model. So none of that covers historical information. That would all be from 2020 to 2050, but that is all available to download from our website.
Okay, that's very nice to know. All right, we're going to need to wrap it up now. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the video file has been posted. I also want to encourage you to send any follow-up questions to info@esig.energy. We'll get them answered and posted as quickly as possible, or finish up entering them through Slido. We really appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you at our next monthly webinar. It's on Wednesday, July 22nd at noon Eastern. The webinar will feature Pete Chandler with the National Grid Electric System Operator in Great Britain, presenting on the topic of System Black Start with DER. Pete's managing a very comprehensive, first-of-a-kind project, going from study right through to implementation, which will provide some very interesting insights, I think, for everyone. I hope you'll all be able to join us once again for that. Further information on all the webinars and meetings can be found on our website at www.esig.energy under Events, and in our newsletters and informational emails, and you're all invited to attend. Caitlin, I want to thank you again for a very timely, informative, interesting, well-done webinar, and thanks all of you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you later this month for the Black Start with DER webinar on July 22nd. And in the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks again for your participation. Bye now.